The morning had come in cold and pale, the kind of autumn morning that polished the stones of London to a grey mirror finish and made every footstep sound deliberate. Dorothea Vane stood on the broad stone steps of St. George's Church in Hanover Square, one gloved hand on the iron railing, and she almost turned and walked away. She had been standing there long enough that a solicitor's clerk had passed twice on the pavement below, glancing up each time with the wariness of a man who recognized someone standing at the edge of a decision. The Duke of Ashbourne stood 3 steps above her, his hat in his hand, his face as still as weather that had not yet declared itself. He had spoken his terms already. He had spoken them clearly, in the measured cadences of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and everything he had said was correct and fair, and utterly without warmth. And Dorothea's hand had tightened on the railing until she could feel the cold iron through her glove. He needed a wife with funds liquid enough to satisfy his late brother's principal creditors by the month's end. He needed a woman of respectable family who had not yet been reached by the season's machinery of warning. He had determined, through careful inquiry, that Miss Dorothea Vane, daughter of the late Mr. Gerald Vane of Hertfordshire, currently employed as companion to Mrs. Harrington of Grosvenor Street, possessed £4,000 in a settled bequest from her great-aunt, and had been in London fewer than 8 weeks. This left her, at present, as the only woman of acceptable family in the city, whose answer was not already decided for her. He had not said that last part. He had not needed to. She looked at the iron railing. The street below was filling with the morning's commerce: a coal cart, a flower girl, a pair of nursemaids with their charges, and the ordinary moving world looked very self-sufficient and indifferent from these steps, the kind of world a woman could walk back into without announcement. She thought of her father's pocketbook, tucked inside her mantle against her ribs. She thought of the letter folded inside it. The one she had read so many times the paper had begun to soften at the fold. She thought of what it meant to be 30 days from the end of her employment, with no position arranged and no family to receive her, and she thought of pride, which was the only inheritance she had left that could not be sold. She was very nearly already on the pavement. Then the Duke of Ashbourne said something he had not planned to say. "I saw what you did for the footman," he said, "at Lady Haverstock's morning call. You did not have to do it." He said it quietly, without inflection of offer or apology, as if he were reporting a fact that had been lying in his possession for some days, and he had not known what to do with it, until this moment. Dorothea's hand released the railing. She stood on the church steps for one full breath, the cold air moving across her face, and then she turned not toward the street, but toward him, and something in the set of her shoulders changed. She said, "Very well, Your Grace," in the tone her father had taught her to use when signing a contract, clear-eyed and still-handed, with full knowledge of what the signature meant. The Duke looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face so briefly it might not have been there at all. He put his hat back on and offered her his arm, and they walked the remaining steps into the church together. And the clerk on the pavement below watched them go with the mild satisfaction of a man who had guessed correctly. What Dorothea did not yet know was that the terms she had just accepted were only the beginning of the negotiation. She did not know that the Duke of Ashbourne, for all the control he had brought to those steps, had not anticipated her hesitation. He had not expected either how much it would cost him when she almost let go. If someone like her is already familiar to you, the woman standing at the edge of what she needs with her hand on the iron rail, stay a little longer. This story knows her well. 6 weeks before that morning, Dorothea Vane had arrived in London on the afternoon coach from St. Albans with a single trunk, a small leather case, and the particular composure of a woman who had buried her father 3 months before and was not going to grieve about it in public. Mrs. Harrington had engaged her through a reputable agency, and the position was a good one by the measures available to a woman of Dorothea's circumstances: a warm room, a modest quarterly wage, and an employer whose principal vices were late hours and a pronounced appetite for card parties. Mrs. Harrington was not unkind. She was also not, as Dorothea understood within a fortnight, a woman with the position to protect anyone. She moved through London society on the goodwill of others, principally on the goodwill of Lady Priscilla Haverstock, whose regard was the social equivalent of a letter of credit, accepted everywhere and revocable without notice. Lady Haverstock was 62, broad-shouldered, and as certain of her own judgments as a woman who had never been wrong in a way she was required to acknowledge. She had decided on her niece Cecily as the next Duchess of Ashburn before the late Duke's obituary had dried in the newspaper, and she had spent 8 months constructing that certainty into something that resembled, to the casual observer, inevitability. Miss Cecily Haverstock was beautiful, well-dowried, and accustomed to being told she was the correct choice. She wore her certainty the way she wore her pearls, as though it had always belonged to her. Dorothea had been in London 11 days when she first attended a morning call at Lady Haverstock's house in Park Lane. She had sat in the corner and poured tea and listened with the patience her father had given her, forming no opinions she was required to express. She had also, quietly, identified that the elderly Baroness at the far end of the sofa was diabetic and being served the wrong tea, and she had corrected the matter in the manner of someone who notices things and addresses them without making a ceremony of the noticing. It was Lady Haverstock who had finally attended to her. "My dear Mrs. Harrington," she had said, in the particular carrying voice she deployed when she wished to be overheard without appearing to wish it. "Where did you find this companion of yours? She has a solicitor's daughter's manner about her, hasn't she? Very correct, I'm sure. Rather determined." She said it without looking at Dorothea, and the smile on her mouth had nothing to do with warmth. The room heard it, as it was intended to hear it, and a dozen pairs of eyes briefly registered Dorothea's plain gray gown and serviceable gloves, and the total absence of any jewelry at all, and then looked away. Dorothea had continued pouring tea. Her face had remained composed, her hand had remained steady, and she had finished the cup she was pouring before she set the pot down. Lady Haverstock had watched this with the particular attention of a woman who had expected a flinch and received instead a posture, and something behind her eyes had registered the distinction, though she did not adjust her expression to reflect it. Her father had taught her the difference between a word that needed answering and a word designed only to be answered, and Lady Haverstock's reduction was the latter kind. To answer it would have been to accept its terms. Dorothea declined to accept its terms. That evening, in the thin firelight of her small room at the top of Mrs. Harrington's townhouse, she opened her father's pocketbook. She read his letter once, the way she sometimes did on days when she needed to remember the weight of being known. He had written it 3 weeks before he died, in the careful legal hand of a man who chose his words for truth rather than comfort. She closed the book and set it on the bedside table, and sat for a while in the orange warmth. And she did not feel sorry for herself, which had always been her most stringent discipline. The late Mr. Gerald Vane of Hertfordshire had been a solicitor of modest practice and excellent judgment, and he had raised his daughter on the same principles he applied to contracts. Accuracy was a form of kindness. Clarity was more useful than comfort. A person of worth did not require the world's confirmation of it, only the patience to wait for the world to notice. She had brought his pocketbook to London. She had brought it the way one carries something from a house before it is cleared. not because it is valuable in the accounting sense, but because it cannot be left behind. The Duke of Ashburn came to Grosvenor Street for the first time on a Tuesday morning, when the October rain had settled over London in earnest. Dorothea was reading correspondence aloud to Mrs. Harrington when Groves the butler appeared with a card on a salver. And Mrs. Harrington went very still in the way of a woman who has been told a certain guest might eventually call, and has not quite believed it until his card was in her hand. "Show him in 5 minutes," she said. "Miss Vane, you may step out." Dorothea stepped out. She retreated to the morning room and sat with a book she did not read, listening to the Duke's measured baritone against Mrs. Harrington's higher responses. The words indistinct, but the register clear enough that something was being arranged. When she was called back, she found Mrs. Harrington with bright patches of color in her cheeks, and the Duke still present, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind him. He was tall and contained, and his face when he turned was the face of a man who had learned very early that revealing nothing was a form of armor, and who had worn it so long he had perhaps forgotten it was armor at all. He looked at her with the civil acknowledgment owed to a person of minimal social account. He looked a moment longer than that acknowledgment required, and she felt the attention without being able to name it. He called again on Thursday, and again the following Saturday. And each time Dorothea was present in the room, and each time he said very little to her directly. He spoke to Mrs. Harrington with the smooth efficiency of a man working through a list, and Dorothea understood, with the clear-eyed patience her father had given her, that she was being assessed. She was not certain she minded this. She was entirely certain she did not like it. It was on the second visit that she saw him look at her in a way that was not assessment. She had been in the corridor outside the sitting room, having discovered that Peter, one of the young footmen, barely 17 years old, had been accused by Lady Haverstock's visiting maid of breaking a small painted figure from the mantelpiece. The maid had said so loudly, in front of 3 other servants, and Peter stood with the careful blankness of a young man who had learned that protesting made things considerably worse. Dorothea had been in the room when the figure fell. She knew it had been knocked from the mantelpiece by Lady Haverstock's elderly spaniel, and she knew the maid had been standing 3 feet away and had seen it too. She said so. She said it in the tone her father had used for uncomfortable but unambiguous facts, not unkindly, not loudly, with a precision that left no reasonable room for argument. The maid retreated. Peter exhaled. Dorothea returned to her work. She had not known the Duke of Ashburn was standing in the corridor doorway behind her. She discovered this, in a small and significant way, 3 weeks later on the steps of St. George's, when he said the sentence he had been carrying without knowing where to set it down. The betrothal was announced in the papers 3 days after the church steps, in 4 plain lines that named the Duke of Ashburn and Miss Dorothea Vane, late of Hertfordshire, and said nothing more because there was nothing more the paper required. Lady Haverstock read it at breakfast. The consequence reached Dorothea in the form of 2 pages of written outrage delivered to Mrs. Harrington, and a particular quality of watchful attention in every room she subsequently entered. Lady Haverstock received her at Park Lane a fortnight after the announcement, with the warmth of a woman who has decided to be kind to someone she intends to defeat. "Miss Vane," she said, in the carrying voice, while a dozen guests sat over their morning tea and pretended not to listen. "One does hope you understand what you are walking into. The Duke of Ashburn's affairs are, I understand, quite complicated. One trusts you know enough of legal matters to read what you are signing." The room was very attentive. Lady Haverstock's smile was warm. Dorothea said with complete composure, "I read everything carefully, my lady. It is a habit my father gave me." And she did not flinch. and the room registered her steadiness with the mixed reaction of people who were impressed and not entirely certain they were permitted to be. That evening, Edmund came to Grosvenor Street and walked with Dorothea in the small back garden, which was not much of a garden in the first weeks of November, but was at least private. He walked its perimeter twice without speaking. She had come to understand this about him. He spoke when he had something to say, and the silences between were not evasion, but economy. She found, somewhat to her own irritation, that she did not mind the silences. "Lady Haverstock will be a persistent problem," he said on the second turn. "I have gathered that," she said. "Do not attend her calls." She heard it as an instruction. Her back straightened. "I will manage my own social engagements, Your Grace." He stopped walking. He looked at her in the failing October light with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite something else. And then he said, "Of course. Forgive me." The apology was unadorned and brief and clearly cost him something. She had not expected it. She registered it without letting it show, which was harder than it should have been. And she could not have said why. The following morning she received, without accompanying note, a card for Lady Dunmore's musicale on Thursday evening, sealed with his crest. Lady Dunmore and Lady Haverstock were in a state of permanent social hostility that all of London understood, which meant the evening was entirely free of carrying voices and significant looks. The soprano was excellent. Dorothea sat in the third row and listened to the handle with the particular attention of a woman who has discovered, without having planned to, that a room she entered reluctantly has become pleasant. If you have ever watched two people learn to read each other across the full width of their own restraint, you will know the patience that requires. If you have not, stay a little longer. It is worth the watching. The arranged courtship proceeded across October and into November in a series of public appearances and private conversations that accumulated in ways Dorothea had not permitted herself to plan for. He walked with her on Tuesday mornings in the park when the fashionable hour had not yet filled the paths. He sat beside her at the Marsden dinner and spoke to their hosts with a political fluency she found she was watching rather than listening to, tracking the way his expression altered by almost nothing between the public address and the private aside to her, from performance into something quieter and more unguarded. She noticed, one Tuesday, that he had placed himself between her and the street, without appearing to intend it. She noticed that at the Marsden table he had deflected a question about her background before it could become an embarrassment, so smoothly that the questioner seemed unaware of having been managed. She noticed that on wet stone steps he offered his arm before she had asked, and that he did not comment on the necessity. He issued commands that were not explanations. "Eat something," he said once, at a supper where she had been too occupied managing Mrs. Harrington's social anxieties to serve herself. A plate appeared before her. She ate it because the command was correct, and the food was necessary, and arguing would have been a waste of precision. She was not sure when she had begun to hear the protection inside the commands. She suspected it had happened slowly, the way conviction accumulates before it can be named. At the Dunmore musicale, 3 weeks into the arrangement, she had looked up from the soprano's third piece and found him watching her rather than the stage. He looked away immediately, with the discipline of a man who was accustomed to not being caught, and she looked back at the soprano. And they did not refer to the moment at any point on the journey home. She registered it, privately, with the same composure she had applied to everything else, and she sat with it for several days before she acknowledged to herself that she had registered it at all. It was in the park, on the 4th Tuesday, that Lady Haverstock's campaign reached her most directly. Mrs. Carlyle of Berkeley Square was walking with her daughter along the south path, and she and Dorothea passed close enough that the exchange of nods was unavoidable. Mrs. Carlyle's nod was correct and very brief. Her daughter's was warmer, and she quickly suppressed it. Later, at Lady Dunmore's card evening, Dorothea heard Mrs. Carlyle tell Lady Haverstock that the Duke could have had Cecily, who had 12,000 and excellent connections, and had instead tied himself to a solicitor's daughter who brought 4 and a country manor. She had not changed expression. She had counted the cards in her hand and played her next with precision, and won the trick. In the park one Tuesday, they passed a young woman in mourning who was struggling to manage a small child and a large parcel, and her composure all at once. Dorothea stopped. She helped the young woman reorder the child and the parcel in a quiet, efficient way that required no ceremony, and the woman thanked her with the gratitude of someone too worn for elaboration. They walked on. Edmund said nothing for the length of 2 paths. Then he said, "Is that the same for everyone, or only for people who need it?" "It is the same," she said. He was quiet for another moment. "Your father taught you that?" It was not a question. She said, "Yes," and did not elaborate. And the economy of the exchange felt, for the first time in his company, something close to ease. The wound came to her on a Wednesday afternoon in November, when the fog had settled over London so completely that the garden below the window of Ashburn House's small study was entirely invisible, and she had been shown to wait there while the butler went to find the Duke, and she was left alone with the room. It was spare by aristocratic standards. A desk with a writing surface kept clear, 2 chairs, bookshelves arranged with the efficiency of a man who used them rather than displayed them, a single portrait on the far wall, a painting in oils, a young woman with light brown hair and a quality of still self-possession about her face, the look of someone accustomed to being well loved. Beside the portrait, on the narrow shelf below it, a small hinged miniature case lay open. The miniature matched the portrait in the angle of the chin, in the quality of the eyes. Dorothea looked at it for the length of time it took to understand what she was seeing. Then she looked away. Then she heard his step in the corridor and composed herself. And when he entered, he stopped for a half-second at the sight of her standing near the shelf. He looked at the miniature. He looked at her. He crossed the room in 3 strides and closed the miniature case and placed it face down on the shelf, with the quietness of a man who does not trust himself to be careless with a thing. "Charlotte," he said. "My wife. She died 4 years ago. The child also." He said it in the tone of a document committed to memory, one no longer permitted to change him, and the completeness of the recitation told her more than the words did. He had loved Charlotte. She understood this without being told, the way one understands weight by the effort required to carry it. He had loved her, and Charlotte had died, and he had decided somewhere in the 4 years since that loving was a capacity he could not be trusted to exercise without consequence. "I am sorry," she said. "I do not require condolence." "I know," she said. "I said it anyway." He stood at the shelf for a moment with his back to the room. She watched his shoulders settle into the stillness she had come to recognize as the posture he held when choosing, very deliberately, what to do next. She thought his conclusion about himself was wrong. Not false, she amended internally, but wrong in the specific way that a careful man's reasoning can be wrong when he is too close to the evidence to see the shape of it. He turned from the shelf and said, in the voice he used to close a subject, "I have had the solicitor draw up the additional papers you requested." "Thank you," she said. She sat and read the papers and made 2 small notes in the margins with the pencil from her reticule. And he sat across the desk and watched her read with the particular attention of a man who has been telling himself he is not paying attention. When she passed the papers back, he read her marginal notes. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted almost imperceptibly, and she recognized it, with a warmth she had not prepared herself for, as the edge of something that was almost a smile. It was brief. She was fairly certain he did not know she had seen it. He signed where she indicated. Inside her mantle she could feel the edge of her father's pocketbook. She thought of the letter inside it. She thought of a man who had decided he was capable only of ruin. And she thought he was catastrophically and specifically mistaken about himself. And she did not say so, because there would be a time for that, or there would not. And this was not yet the time. The invitation to Mrs. Harrington's card party on the third Friday of November reached Lady Haverstock's house in Park Lane, and Lady Haverstock accepted it with the consideration of a woman who had identified the venue and the occasion as useful. Dorothea did not know, dressing that evening, that anything was planned. She knew only that Edmund had said he would come later, after a prior engagement, and that she had been managing Lady Haverstock's sustained presence in her life with the patience of a woman who has accepted that a certain kind of headache does not yield to treatment. She should have known by the quality of the room when she entered it. There is a particular readiness in a room that has been waiting for something to happen, a contained attentiveness in the way people hold their glasses and arrange their faces. Dorothea felt it the moment she stepped through the drawing-room door, and 14 heads turned toward her with the slightly too careful ease of people who already knew something she did not. Lady Haverstock was at the card table nearest the fireplace, in conversation with a small man in a dark coat who carried a leather case and had the look of a man who had been engaged for a specific purpose. She rose when Dorothea entered and brought the man forward and introduced him as Mr. Colbeck, a solicitor, with an expression of warm concern that she had arranged carefully. "I am so glad you are here, Miss Vane," she said, "because Mr. Colbeck has been reviewing the matter of the Ashburn betrothal and has found a most interesting point of procedure." Mr. Colbeck opened his case. He produced a document and explained, in the measured language of a man who had rehearsed this, that the terms of the late Duke's inheritance settlement contained a provision overlooked at the time of the new Duke's succession, that any property agreement made within the first 20 months required the written confirmation of the senior family trustee, Lord Westhall, who was presently in Italy and had not been consulted. Without Lord Westhall's written confirmation, the betrothal as constituted was procedurally incomplete. Lady Haverstock let the room absorb this. Then she said, into the careful silence, "It seems the Duke has been rather hasty. One hopes a solicitor's daughter would have caught such a thing. Solicitors' daughters are supposed to know these matters, are they not?" She did not phrase it as a question. The room was very quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily. Dorothea looked at the document in Mr. Colbeck's hands, reading what she could of it from where she stood. And she understood within 4 seconds that the provision was genuine, that the omission was real, and that Lady Haverstock had spent considerable time and money finding that particular page inside that particular settlement. She also understood that Edmund had not come, and the clock said 9:30. She stood inside that knowledge for 3 breaths, and did not let it reach her face. She thought of the church steps, and the iron railing, and the choice she had made on them. And she stood with it the way she stood with everything that mattered, squarely, and without the luxury of flinching. Then she said, with the composure that was the last thing she would not surrender, "Thank you, Mr. Colbeck. May I see the document?" She held out her hand, and he gave it to her, perhaps because he had not been prepared for anyone to simply ask for it, and she read it completely and carefully and with the full attention of a woman whose father had taught her to read contracts as though her circumstances depended upon the accuracy of her reading. which tonight they did. The room watched her with the silence of people who had expected confusion and received instead precision. Lady Haverstock's expression of warm concern began to work visibly harder at maintaining itself. Dorothea set the document on the nearest table. "The provision is genuine," she said, in a voice that carried clearly to the room's edges. "Lord Westhall's written confirmation is required." She paused for one deliberate breath. "My father was the solicitor who drafted Lord Westhall's most recent letter of attorney. Lord Westhall countersigned it through my father's office 6 months ago. His current contact in England is my father's former partner, Mr. Aldridge of Holborn. I expect a written confirmation could be had within the week." The room rearranged its silence. Lady Haverstock's posture held itself in place. The door of the drawing-room opened. Edmund Carew, Duke of Ashburn, came in out of the November night with the cold still on his coat, and his face the color of a man who had been moving with purpose and had not yet permitted himself to stop. He took in the room in a single assessment, the gathered faces, Lady Haverstock at the card table, Mr. Colbeck's leather case, Dorothea standing near the window with the document in her hand. And he was still for one full second. He crossed the room. Not quickly. Not with the breathlessness of a man arriving to manage a crisis. He crossed it with the deliberateness that made every space he moved through seem arranged in advance, and he stopped beside Dorothea and looked at Lady Haverstock and said nothing for a moment. The moment was long enough that the firelight shifted. The room was very still around it. He said, "Miss Vane is with me. She is my Duchess." 10 words. He said them without decoration. In the same level tone he used when he said "eat something" and "sit down and come inside." The tone that derived its authority not from volume, but from the absolute certainty that the thing was already true, and that anyone who believed otherwise was simply lagging behind the fact. Lady Haverstock's expression of warm concern held itself in place for one more breath, while the room's collective attention reassembled itself around the Duke and Dorothea rather than around the card table and the leather case. Then the expression fell, quietly, in the manner of a posture that has lost the architecture holding it upright. "Your Grace, the settlement provision is addressed," he said. "Mr. Aldridge of Holborn sent word this afternoon. Lord Westhall's written confirmation arrived this morning. I have been to Aldridge's office." Lady Haverstock's mouth opened. Mr. Colbeck quietly closed his leather case and did not reopen it. Cecily Haverstock, who had been seated at the far card table and had said nothing across the whole of the evening, rose and curtsied to Edmund with a composure that cost her something visible, and then said quietly, "I wish you both very well." It was perhaps the truest thing spoken in the room all evening, and Dorothea respected it without reservation. Lady Haverstock excused herself shortly thereafter. Edmund had not looked at Dorothea directly since entering the room. He stood beside her and received the room's reordering with the stillness of a man who had no interest in gloating, because he had no interest in the room at all. It was only as they prepared to leave when Mrs. Harrington pressed Dorothea's hand and said, "My dear," in the compressed voice of a woman who has spent 2 hours in elevated social anxiety, that he glanced at her briefly, and she saw in the glance something she could only describe, after a moment of private consideration, as relief. They walked back to Grosvenor Street together in the cold November air, and he did not speak for the first block and a half. Then he said, "You had already found Aldridge's name. From the document?" "Yes," she said. "I found it from my own solicitor's notes and went to Holborn this afternoon. I did not know you had also identified him." "We arrived at the same conclusion by different routes," she said. He was quiet for another half block. Then he said, with the deliberateness of a man attempting a sentence he does not often attempt. I should have been there sooner. She did not tell him it was all right. She said, yes, because it was true, and because he deserved the truth from her, and because she thought, with a clarity that had not been available to her before tonight, that this was a man who would receive honesty as a courtesy rather than a wound. He accepted it without objection. They walked the remaining distance in the cold, and when he handed her up the steps, she did not release his hand immediately, and he did not step back, and the November night sat quietly around them on the pavement, and did not demand that anyone name what was happening. Inside the small room at the top of the house, the fire had been banked, and the room was warm and orange-lit. Dorothea sat at the edge of the bed and took her father's pocketbook from her mantle and held it in her lap without opening it. She thought of Charlotte's portrait on the shelf in the study. She thought of a man who had decided he was capable only of producing wreckage, and she thought of him in Holborn that afternoon, reading a letter of attorney her father had helped draft, finding the thread that confirmed her position, and going there without telling her, and coming through the drawing-room door with the cold on his coat, and the answer already in his hands, and crossing to stand beside her in front of a room that had expected her to fail. She opened the book. She read the letter once, in the orange light, and sat with it for a while, and then she set it on the bedside table and slept. The following morning he came to call before the fashionable hour, when the street was quiet, and the November light came thin and white through the drawing-room curtains, and she was already dressed because she had not slept late. He had a question for her that had nothing to do with settlements or confirmation letters or procedural provisions. He asked it with the care of a man who knows the weight of a word before he spends it. She answered with the same care. He said her name then, simply, Dorothea, without title or ceremony, and the syllables landed in the quiet morning room with the full weight of a thing that had been a long time coming, and that neither of them had been entirely prepared for. She felt the warmth of it in her hands before she felt it anywhere else, which her father would have said was exactly how conviction works. By December they were at Ashburn Hall, and the first snow had come, and she had settled into the rooms that were now hers, with the composed attentiveness of a woman learning a new language from its textures rather than its vocabulary. The study was warmer than she had expected. The library had windows that faced east and was full of light before noon. The staff were cautious at first, and then not. And it was Peter, the young footman, whom Edmund had quietly arranged to transfer from Mrs. Harrington's household, who told the others in the kitchen that Miss Vane, as they called her still from habit, had a way of noticing things before they needed to be said. The pocketbook came back to her on a Wednesday evening in the second week, set on the small table beside Edmund's reading chair, without comment. She had not noticed it missing from her traveling things, though she had looked for it twice. She did not ask when he had found it, or what he had read. She stood in the study doorway and looked at his face, which was turned toward the fire. And she saw in the set of his jaw and the particular quality of his stillness the precise expression of a man who has read a single line and is still carrying it somewhere in his chest. She crossed the room and picked up the book. He did not look up from the fire. She stood beside the chair with the pocketbook in her hand and the snow pressing at the study windows, white and steady and clean. And she understood then, with the full, clear-eyed certainty her father had given her, the thing she had not permitted herself to name on the church steps 6 weeks before. She had not almost said no. She had almost been wrong. If Dorothea's story stayed with you, the comment below is yours. Thank you for sitting with her until the end.